Hi everyone, in this case reading video we're going to be looking at the Burger King and Hungry Jack's case, which involved a contractual dispute between a franchisee and a franchisor. Alright, so this case concerns the implied obligation to act in good faith, which is one of the areas that we looked at as a limitation upon the right to terminate. And this case also has a few interesting comments around the essentiality of time clauses in commercial contracts. So Hungry Jack's set up as a franchise of Burger King in Australia in 1971, which is something that I didn't always know that they were the same company. But anyway, so Hungry Jack's set up in Australia in 1971. Over the years, there came to be many disputes between Hungry Jack's and the parent company of Burger King. In particular, during the 90s, when Burger King decided they wanted to set up in Australia under their own right, and Hungry Jack's weren't interested in being part of a joint venture, or alternatively, they also weren't interested in being bought out. So Burger King wished to enter the Australian market directly, and a number of things occurred, and you can see this on the slide here. So they offered to buy out stores, and that offer was rejected. They then opened up in Shell service stations. There was some breaches of confidential information where the Hungry Jack's executive fed information about the business methods back to Burger King. In terms of the relationship between the parties themselves, there was a contractual term between them around Hungry Jack's having to open up a certain amount of stores per year in particular locations. And so they were kind of establishing franchises in those locations. They weren't doing it directly, so they were getting in franchisees to manage those stores. But the approval for those franchisees had to come from Burger King. Burger King refused that approval, which then meant that Hungry Jack's breached a contract term which said they had to set up a certain amount of stores, new stores as required. And then eventually Burger King purported to sever the relationship with Hungry Jack's, alleging breach of contract for that failure to open up the certain number of stores. So Hungry Jack's sued, alleging that Burger King actually had no right to terminate, which came down to a construction of contractual terms issue, which we'll get to in a moment. And they also argued that any right to terminate that they did have would have been subject to an implied term of good faith, and that breach of that duty meant that they couldn't terminate under the contract. So what they were pointing or drawing attention to here was the fact that the reason why they breached that clause around setting up a certain amount of new stores was because Burger King capriciously withheld consent for the approval for those stores to go ahead. So it was Burger King's fault, essentially, that Hungry Jack's breached the clause. So for them to then terminate on grounds of them breaching the clause, that was seen as a breach of that duty of good faith. Okay, so Hungry Jack's was successful at trial. Now awarded something like $7 million. And amongst other things, there was said to be a breach of fiduciary obligations, because this is a franchisee-franchisor relationship. And also the right to terminate was rejected by the courts. Burger King appealed to the New South Wales Court of Appeal, who then dismissed the appeal. And you can see a little bit of their reasoning on the next slide. So I mentioned that there was a number of contractual terms around termination within the contract. So the first thing that the court had to look at was whether a clause that purported to give Burger King the right to terminate basically in any circumstance applied here. And that was under clause 15.1. So you can have a look at the information around that clause in the reading excerpt. The court found that that clause, although it was broadly worded, did not give the right to terminate for any breach at all, okay, for all breaches. So then the consideration of the court became whether the breach of the term to open up the new stores was a condition or a warranty, remembering that if it's a condition, the right to terminate arises, whereas if it's a warranty, there's only a right to damages. here, clause 2.1, the clause that required them to open a certain amount of stores a year, was found to be not an essential term of the contract. And part of the reason for that was that a 12-month grace period was written into the clause, and that had not actually expired here. So they had a certain amount of time that they could open the stores, and that time hadn't expired. The court was also persuaded by the fact that there were alternate penalties provided in different terms within the contract, suggesting that this wasn't an essential term. Also, in terms of the test of essentiality, the benefits to Burger King from this were relatively minor. Remembering, I think it's in the facts or something like they were given $20 million or paid $20 million a year under the contract with Hungry Jack's. So they were already reaping the benefits of this franchise agreement. The court also found this term was a little bit ambiguous, and they applied the contra preferendum principle, which essentially just means is when there's an ambiguity, the court will interpret the contract to avoid an unjust consequence. So here, clause 2.1, the clause that required them to open a certain amount of stores per year, was found to be not an essential term of the contract. So they had no right to terminate at common law either. So no contractual right to terminate and no right to terminate at law. Now, because there was no right to terminate, they didn't actually have to look at the good faith argument, but they did consider it here, and the court found that the obligation, implied obligation of good faith did apply to this contract. It does apply to, I guess, all contracts potentially, because otherwise Burger King could refuse to agree to new franchises capriciously, okay? And there's a quote on the slide there around it. So the contractual powers are to be exercised in good faith and reasonably. So they can still have, do things in their own interest, but they mustn't do so for a purpose extraneous to the contract. For example, withholding financial approval when there's literally no basis to do so, so to thwart Hungry Jack's rights under the contract. So here it was found that the denied approvals of those new franchises were not legitimate, and it was simply to harm Hungry Jack's interests, remembering that Burger King are still trying to get a foothold into the Australian market at this time. So in relation to the three issues, it was held by the New South Wales Court of Appeal that Burger King couldn't terminate the contract under the termination clause. Also, they couldn't terminate it because of the breach of clause 2.1, because it wasn't an essential term, and moreover, that they breached an implied duty of good faith. Burger King then sought leave to appeal to the High Court, which was granted, but the appeal was ultimately dismissed by agreement between the parties. Okay, still with me? All right, in terms of the case reading guide questions, these are more just around the construction of the contract. So in terms of the first question, why didn't clause 15.1D, which is the termination clause, that very broad termination clause, why didn't it give Burger King the right to terminate the development agreement for breach of clause 2.1? So on its own, clause 2.1 is mandatory and unqualified. However, a number of other clauses in the contract actually dealt with non-compliance. And there is also significant qualifications to clause 2.1 found elsewhere in the development agreement. Clause 2.2 also requires Burger King to give Hungry Jack's a reasonable extension of time for compliance in cases of delay found to be outside the control of Hungry Jack's. So when would the right to terminate under clause 15.1D for breach of clause 2.1 have arisen? It would have arisen following the end of that grace period, that 12 months following the end of the yearly period specified in clause 2.1. And remember here, that grace period hadn't expired. So that's the operation of the contractual right to terminate. Now, in terms of the second question then, so did breach of clause 2.1 give rise to a right to terminate at law? Okay, which is essentially the question of, is this an essential term or just a warranty? Well, here, when the court considered whether clause 2.1 was an essential term, it considered a number of other clauses which provided for various procedures if clause 2.1 were not complied with, including the grace period. The court ultimately held that clause 2.1 could not be considered an essential term, as it could not be said that Burger King would not have entered into the contract without being assured of strict compliance with it, remembering that there are a number of clauses that all qualified each other. In terms of the question of why did the court hold that 2.1 was not an essential term, so it's a prima facie rule that time stipulations in commercial contracts are essential terms, okay, in commercial contracts. So while prima facie it might be that a time stipulation in commercial contract is an essential term, you still need to look at the construction of the contract itself. And the court said here, when clauses 2.2, 7.3 and 8.1 are considered, it can't be said that a breach of clause 2.1 is an essential term. And this is because the clauses make provision for various circumstances where there has not been strict compliance. Okay, remembering if it's a condition, the second there isn't strict compliance, that right to terminate arises. Okay, so therefore it was held that it's impossible to say that given these other provisions, Burger King would not have entered into the contract unless a strict performance of the promise was possible, because the clauses themselves indicate that this is what happens when strict compliance does not occur, if that makes sense, okay? Have a look at the facts if it doesn't. Read through those clauses closely. 2.2, 7.3, and 8.1. Finally, what did the court say about the essentiality or otherwise of the time stipulations in commercial contracts? And that's just what I mentioned before. So generally in commercial contracts, time stipulations are seen to be prima facie conditions of the contract. However, you still need to actually look at the contract itself, and if there's something in the terms there, like here, which suggests that strict compliance is not necessary, for example, then that time stipulation won't be seen to be a condition, okay? And just to recap what's in your overview PowerPoint for this week, the general position across all contracts, so not just specifically commercial contracts, the general position is that unless a time clause unless a clause in the contract specifically states that it's of the essence or otherwise indicates that strict performance is required, then performance of the obligation within a certain amount of time, that's seen to be a warranty, not a condition, which means that in order to terminate for the failure to complete by a particular date, you'd need to issue a notice to complete. And then if that's not complied within a reasonable time, that's when that right to terminate will arise.